Here's a question you've definitely never asked, but absolutely should. Toilet paper is barely over 100 years old. The soft, clean, perforated roll you take completely for granted is, in the grand scheme of human history, brand new. It's younger than the light bulb, younger than the telephone, which means something kind of staggering when you stop to think about it. For the entire rest of human history, hundreds of thousands of years, every single person who ever lived faced the exact same small, undignified, completely universal daily problem that you do. And they all solved it, without toilet paper, without exception. So how? What do they actually use? Billions upon billions of people, across every continent, every climate, every culture, all dealing with the one thing nobody likes to talk about. And the answer, it turns out, is grosser, funnier, and weirdly more clever than you are ready for. This is the genuine, fully serious, occasionally horrifying history of how humans cleaned up before toilet paper. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The method a person used reveals an astonishing amount about their entire world, their wealth, their landscape, the plants around them, the rivers near them. Even, in one incredible case, their personal enemies. Stick with me, because that one's real. But before we laugh, let's be clear about why this actually matters. Because it's not just a gross-out novelty. This is a genuine survival issue. The waste our bodies produce is loaded with bacteria and parasites. Getting it on your hands, your food, your water, is one of the most direct routes to disease that exists. A huge proportion of the deadly illnesses that have plagued humanity throughout history spread through exactly this pathway. So how a society handled this most private of moments wasn't trivial at all. It was, quietly, a matter of life and death. Clean up badly, and you could sicken yourself, your family, your whole community. The humble question of what to wipe with sits much closer to the heart of human survival than we'd ever want to admit. So our ancestors had every reason to take it seriously. And, in their own ways, they did. But let's go back further than the Romans, further than any civilization, all the way to the very beginning. Because before cities, before farming, before any of the clever tools, we're going to talk about there were just small bands of humans living off the land. So what did they do? The honest answer is that we have very little direct evidence, for the obvious reason that the materials they used, leaves, moss, water, simply rotted away and left no trace. But we can make very good guesses, partly by looking at the animals we're related to and the foraging peoples studied in more recent times. And the picture that emerges is reassuringly simple. Early humans almost certainly used the most abundant things around them. Water, when they were near it, leaves and moss and grass when they weren't. Their own hands rinsed in a stream, maybe a smooth stick or stone. And here's a small, slightly amazing point worth making. Our deep ancestors were intimately, expertly familiar with their local environment, in a way almost none of us are today. They knew every plant around them, which were soft, which were toxic, which would soothe, and which would burn. Choosing what to wipe with was just one more application of that vast botanical knowledge they used for food, medicine, and tools. The same mind that knew which berry would heal you and which would kill you also knew, very precisely, which leaf you definitely did not want to reach for in a hurry. It's a strangely intimate kind of expertise, and every one of your ancestors had it. Now, the first and most important thing to understand is that there was never one single answer. The method depended entirely on where you lived and what was around you. And this splits humanity broadly into two great camps that persist to this very day: the wipers and the washers. Let's start with the washers, because they may have had the better idea all along. In much of the world, particularly across the Middle East, South Asia, and beyond, the traditional method was never paper or any solid object at all. It was water. Simply washing with water, traditionally using the left hand for the task, and reserving the right hand for eating and greeting. This is where that famous cultural rule comes from. The strict division of labor between the hands, which can seem mysterious to outsiders until you understand its deeply practical, hygienic origin. And here's the thing. From a pure cleanliness standpoint, the washers arguably had it right the whole time. Water cleans more thoroughly than dry paper ever could. It's the same reason the modern bidet exists, and the same reason a huge portion of the world today still considers the idea of cleaning up with dry paper alone to be, frankly, a bit baffling and unhygienic. Billions of people right now would tell you that the supposedly advanced toilet paper user is the one doing it wrong. To them, wiping with dry paper and considering yourself clean is a little like wiping mud off your hands with a dry tissue and calling it washing. This wasn't a primitive method waiting to be replaced. It was, and is, a genuinely effective solution. That much of humanity simply never saw a reason to abandon. So that's one great branch of human history. Where there was reliable water, people often just used water. Elegant, effective, done. But what about everyone else? What about the people in colder, drier places where plunging into water year-round wasn't practical? This is where things get creative. And by creative, I mean we now have to talk about the things people scrape themselves with. So let's go through nature's toilet paper aisle. The most common materials, all over the world, were simply whatever the local landscape offered up. Leaves by the handful. The bigger and softer the better, though you learned very quickly and very memorably which plants to avoid. Moss, which is genuinely soft and absorbent and was prized. In colder regions for good reason. Grass, hay, and straw. In snowy climates, people use snow itself, which is bracing, but undeniably clean and effective. Along coastlines, people used shells and the soft husks of seaweed. And famously, in rural America, right up into the 20th century, the go-to material was the dried corn cob. Yes, the corn cob, which sounds like a joke until you realize a dried cob is actually somewhat soft, absorbent, and was available by the literal bushel on every farm. It was so standard that even after paper arrived, the old catalog in the outhouse, the Sears Roebuck, served double duty. First you read it, then you used it, which is its own quiet little comedy of progress. So far, so rustic. But now we come to the ancient civilization that approached this problem with the same ambitious engineering they brought to everything else and produced one of the most simultaneously impressive and horrifying solutions in all of human history. Rome. Picture a Roman public latrine. It's a long room, with a marble or stone bench running along the walls, and that bench has a row of keyhole-shaped holes cut into it. And here's your first surprise. There are no dividers, no stalls, no privacy whatsoever. People sat side by side, doing their business, having conversations, discussing politics and business, completely communally. To a Roman, the toilet was a social space. The idea that this should be a private, solitary act would have struck them as strange. And it's worth pausing on just how seriously Rome took all of this, because it reframes the sponge from a gross joke into one piece of a genuinely sophisticated system. Rome was obsessed with sanitation. They built a colossal sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, so vast that an ancient writer claimed hay wagons could pass through its channels, and so important that the naturalist Pliny the Elder called it the single most noteworthy of all Rome's achievements. More noteworthy than the roads, the temples, the conquests, the drains. They were so reverent about it that they had a goddess for it. Her name was Cloacina, the goddess of the sewer, who was eventually associated with Venus herself, and who had a shrine right in the Roman Forum, the beating heart of the city. Think about that. A civilization that built a holy shrine to the goddess of the drains. They understood, on some deep level, that managing human waste was sacred work, the thing that allowed 1 million people to live, packed together without dying of their own filth. So when you picture that communal sponge, don't picture ignorance. Picture a society that cared about cleanliness so intensely. They made a deity out of plumbing, doing the best they could with the tools they had. Now, running along the floor in front of the bench was a small channel of flowing water, and resting in it was the tool, the infamous tersorium, a natural sea sponge, fixed to the end of a long wooden stick. You can probably see where this is going. You would take the sponge on its stick, reach down and around, clean yourself, and then, here's the part that makes modern people recoil. Rinse the sponge in the channel of running water, or in a bucket of salt water or vinegar, and leave it for the next person. The same sponge, used by everyone who came into that latrine that day, shared. I want to give the Romans some credit here, because they weren't being mindless. The running water was meant to rinse it. The salt and vinegar were genuine attempts at disinfecting, And vinegar does have some real antibacterial properties. By the standards of the time, this was a system, a deliberate piece of hygiene technology in a society that genuinely prized cleanliness and built spectacular plumbing. But by our standards, a single sponge shared by a room full of strangers is the stuff of nightmares, and almost certainly helped spread intestinal parasites and disease right through the population. It's a perfect, almost poetic example of a clever solution that fixed one problem while quietly creating another. I should add, in fairness, that some modern scholars now argue that sponge on a stick may actually have been used to clean the toilet itself, rather than the person. The honest truth is the ancient sources are a little vague, and historians still debate it. But the communal sponge has rooted itself in our imagination, and you can see why. Now here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. If the Romans had the sponge, what did their neighbors and predecessors, the Greeks, use? And the answer is somehow even more alarming, and it leads us to the single greatest detail in this entire story. The ancient Greeks, for all their philosophy and art and democracy, often cleaned up using small, smooth stones. Or, even better, fragments of broken pottery, rounded off at the edges. These ceramic pieces were called pessoi. And this isn't just a guess, by the way. Archaeologists studying ancient Greek and Roman sites have found these very pottery fragments, recut into smooth oval shapes, in the remains beneath old latrines, and a study in a respected medical journal confirmed their, let's say, utilitarian purpose. People really did scrape themselves clean with rounded shards of pottery. And now, the detail I promised you. The payoff. Stay with me. In ancient Greece, there was a political practice called ostracism. When the citizens wanted to banish someone from the city, someone they hated, a rival, a politician they'd had enough of, they would vote by scratching that person's name onto a piece of broken pottery. The Greek word for these inscribed shards was ostraka, which is the very root of our word ostracism. You see where this is going. A broken piece of pottery with a name scratched on it, and a broken piece of pottery used to wipe yourself, were sometimes the same kind of object. Which means some scholars believe that ancient Greeks would deliberately take a shard inscribed with the name of a person they despised and use it to clean their backsides. They were, quite literally, wiping themselves with their enemy's name, insulting a rival in the most profound, most personal, most hilarious way physically possible. It's the most elaborate diss in human history, and it's completely real. Try staying mad at someone in the modern world. You can't even write their name on toilet paper without it smudging. The Greeks had us beat on petty revenge by 2,500 years. Now, you might assume that after the glory of Roman plumbing, things only got better from there. They did not. When the Roman Empire fell, much of its sanitation knowledge fell with it, and Europe entered a long stretch where hygiene actually went backward. The grand sewers and public latrines crumbled, and medieval Europeans largely returned to the old standbys. Moss, hay, leaves, grass, and rags, depending on what you had and what you could afford. In medieval castles, the toilet was often a small stone room called a garderobe, built jutting out over the castle wall, where everything simply dropped down into the moat below, which does rather change how you picture those romantic castle moats. Inside monasteries, ironically, monks often had some of the most advanced plumbing of the age, along with communal supplies of cloth or other materials for cleaning up, organized with the same care they brought to everything else. And there's one delightful detail from a few centuries later that I have to share. A famous English lord once advised his son to make productive use of his time in the privy by buying a cheap edition of the Latin poets, reading a few pages while seated, and then, putting those very pages to their final use afterward. Sending them, as he put it, down to the goddess Cloacina, read the poem, then wipe with it. He considered this an efficient use of both literature and paper. It's the single most cultured description of this act ever committed to writing, and I think about it more than I'd like to admit. So we've seen the washers, the foragers, the Roman engineers, the spiteful Greeks, and the backsliding medievals. But there's one more axis to all of this, and it's a familiar one: wealth. Because of course, what you wiped with was also a marker of status. For the poor, throughout most of history, it was whatever nature provided. Leaves, moss, a handful of straw. But for the wealthy, the experience could be dramatically more pleasant. Rich Romans might use soft wool, sometimes soaked in rose water, a world away from a communal sponge. Wealthy people in various cultures had access to soft cloths and rags reserved for the purpose. The simple comfort of how you cleaned yourself in the most private moment of your day silently reflected exactly where you sat in the social hierarchy. Even here, in the most humbling and universal of human acts, the gap between rich and poor quietly asserted itself. Inequality, it turns out, follows us absolutely everywhere. And the toilet paper we know, that came, like so many things, from China. The Chinese were using paper for personal hygiene more than 1,000 years before Europe caught on, with references going back many centuries, and mass production of toilet paper underway while medieval Europeans were still reaching for handfuls of hay. The soft roll in your bathroom is a surprisingly recent arrival to most of the world, and for most of human history, it simply did not exist as an option at all. So let's pull this strange, slightly disgusting, genuinely fascinating story together. What looks at first like a silly question, what did people use before toilet paper, turns out to be a window into almost everything about a human society. Whether they had water, what plants and materials surrounded them, how they balanced privacy against community, how they understood cleanliness and disease, even without the science to explain it, how they treated their rich and their poor, and even, in the case of those vengeful Greeks, how they channeled their pettiest human emotions. The history of wiping is, secretly, a history of human ingenuity, adaptation, and culture, hiding inside the one topic we're all too embarrassed to study. And here's the part I find genuinely moving, underneath all the comedy. Because it's easy to laugh at the sponge and the pottery shard and the corn cob, but step back and look at what's really there. Every one of these solutions represents a human being in a world far harder than ours, taking care of themselves with whatever they had, maintaining their dignity, their cleanliness, their health, using the wisdom and the materials of their time. The same fundamental drive that makes you reach for the roll on the wall drove a Roman to the sponge, a Greek to the smooth stone, a farmer to the corn cob, and half the world to a simple jug of water. Across all of human history, in every place and time, people just wanted to feel clean, to take care of their own bodies, to handle their business with a little bit of dignity and move on with their day. It is one of the most universal experiences that has ever existed. Every human who has ever lived, every pharaoh and peasant, every genius and fool, every person you've ever admired across all of history, all faced this exact same humble moment, and all just did their best with what they had. There is something strangely unifying in that. A great equalizer running quietly through the entire human story. So here's my last question for you. We treat toilet paper as one of the most basic, unremarkable things in our lives, a thing beneath our notice entirely. But it's the end point of hundreds of thousands of years of human problem solving, a tiny everyday luxury that almost nobody who ever lived got to enjoy. So the next time you reach for that roll without a single thought, maybe give a small silent nod to the sponge-sharing Romans, the stone-using Greeks, the corn cob farmers, and the billions of ordinary people across time who handled this universal little challenge with whatever the world handed them. Are the things we call ordinary really ordinary at all? Or is almost every boring convenience in your life secretly a small miracle, paid for by everyone who had to live without it? Let me know what you think in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it. Maybe keep it slightly more dignified than the Greeks did. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'll see you soon.